This is the Marriage Podcast, and I'm your host, Alexandra Stockwell. I'm a physician turned relationship and intimacy expert, and I specialize in showing couples how to have incredible, passionate relationships. I myself have been married for 25 years. My husband and I have 4 children and full professional lives, and we've created an amazing relationship. If you want to deepen your understanding of your own relationship and learn to access new heights of emotional, sensual, and erotic intimacy, you're in the right place because I will show you how. Let's dive in. Hey everyone, this is Alexandra, and I am thrilled to introduce you to my daughter, Josephine. Josephine is turning 25 the day that this episode drops, and so I'm going to be interviewing her on what it's like to be a child in a family where the parents have a hot, aligned, and very intimate marriage. Josephine is a graduate school in viola performance. She's an amazing classical musician. She also is a genius with hair. If you look at her Instagram, what is your Instagram, Josephine?
I was not expecting an Instagram plug. It's just my name, Josephine_Stockwell. Follow for hair content and viola content.
Yeah, Josephine_Stockwell. You can see some of the most incredible designs with hair. And in addition to being a genius at hair and creating the most soulful, beautiful, incredible music, Josephine really is sunshine. When she walks into a room, it gets brighter. So, Josephine, thank you so much for joining me in this episode of my podcast.
It is an honor to be here. I have loved seeing what you've done with it and how it's grown. And so it's fun to be a guest. It's crazy to be turning 25. What the heck? And it made me feel warm inside when you called me sunshine. I think that's something I aim to do, and I feel lucky that I don't have to work too hard to do it.
Well, you know that I think you look a lot like my Nana Sarah, who lived to 104. And she used to describe when she was a child that her parents would often, especially her father, would be reading and the sun would go down, but he would be really engrossed in his book. And she would come into the room and turn the light on. And he would always say, "You bring the light."
Oh, that's so cute.
So anything else you want people to know about you as we go forward into this conversation, sweetheart?
Well, I think did you say that I'm your oldest child? To me, that feels very important, and the only girl. Presumably anyone who's been following you knows that, but I take great pride in that part of my identity. And otherwise, no, I think that's good.
Okay, well, you're right to mention that. So yes, you're the oldest, the only girl, and you have 3 younger brothers. So one of 4, and you're definitely the very first to turn 25. What does that mean to you?
Ooh, well, a quarter of a century feels really big. I'm getting emotional. Whoa. I think in terms of birthdays, like you're a teenager and then you turn 18 and you're off at college, and then like 21's the fun one. And people on my 21st birthday always said, like, the rest of them, like it all goes together. It doesn't matter. But something about 25 just feels really big for me. I don't totally know why, because I think I'm already like as much of an adult as I'm going to be. And like, yeah, I can rent a car, but like if you use a certain company, you can rent a car under 25. So that doesn't feel like the significance of it. But I mean, maybe it's informed by COVID a little bit, like just reflecting and like experiencing time at a slower pace. At least that's how it's been for me. But yeah, I'm not exactly sure why. But as you can hear, as you can tell, it feels big.
Yeah, well, this seems like a good moment to say that I know that parents get so excited, understandably, when they witness their children as they learn to crawl, learn to walk, learn to talk. There's so much incredible human development that each child goes through in those first few years. And I have to say, as a mother of 4, I have yet to get to a time where I'm not completely fascinated by your growth and development. And you at 25 and your brothers at 22, 16, and 9, I'm continually noticing new things and just as fascinated as when each of you learned to walk. But of course, as a mother of teens and now 20s, I know better than to clap and emote with glee. But I'm really super excited for what turning 25 means in your development. And maybe with that, we'll pivot because one of the reasons that I brought you onto the podcast is really to get your experience, your perspective as the oldest child, duly noted, in a family where the parents completely prioritize meaning our relationship and keeping it hot and juicy and really delicious, while also Daddy and I are both completely committed to being stable, attentive parents as well. So you've experienced us, obviously. You've also witnessed lots of friends' parents. Any observations you have as we go into this topic?
Well, I think it's interesting because the first theme that I would say is not necessarily for people who also choose to bring intimacy to the fore, but I think when there's like intentionality around that, whether it's to share it or to not share it, that creates harmoniousness. I realize it sounds vague, but I'm thinking of specific people I know and specific instances where it seems like being really intentional about how much power cultivating this part of life has, and whether you share it or not, tends to create a more like cohesive family dynamic, a more cohesive couple. Because I feel like where this can go sideways is when people aren't actually on the same page. So that's the first thing that I would say I observe. I definitely have always felt really lucky to be super close with both of my parents. And, you know, it surprises my friends when I tell stories about this, that, or the other thing that I told you or Daddy.
Let's be a little explicit because people can't possibly imagine that if you have an interesting or in any way unusual or groundbreaking sexual experience, that you're probably going to be mentioning that to me.
Yes. Yeah. Or an uninteresting one. Like, I think I've told you everything, honestly, that has ever happened.
I don't think that is true. That gives the wrong impression. I think you have actually really good self-containment and boundaries. And there have been phases where you didn't want me to know anything, where you didn't want to be a sneaky person, but you definitely omitted plenty. I feel like our relationship has had an ebb and flow. It would be a false impression to think that I've known everything every step of the way.
You know what's interesting about that, though, is that's how I think about it. As you said that just now, I'm like, okay, yeah, I can think of situations where I didn't say something, or I waited to say something, or I thought you might be worried, so I waited until a few months after or whatever. But
I want to comment on that. That's so funny that we both kept wanting to say something, because like I really want to slow down and comment on that because I think it is so important. It's actually something that I talk about a lot, particularly when speaking with parents of young children, where one of my main things that I say is that it's not more time that you need. It's the quality of the interactions which creates connection and, in the case of parents of young children, erotic energy, when one is intentional in how the interactions that you have feel. And obviously, we're not talking about an erotic connection, but the kind of closeness that you feel, Josephine, in my opinion, has everything to do with the quality of how we interact and not actually the quantity. There have been times in your life, you know, when you were 5 and 7 and 10, when the quantity was really quite high when you weren't in school. then yes, you would share a great deal. But we've had weeks where we haven't spoken. And even now, with your life practicing for auditions for graduate school, and my life, which is full with work and family life with the two children still at home, and we're in different time zones. And so I don't actually think that we talk that often, but when we do, we immediately drop into a sense of connection. And the quality of the connection we have is definitely a beautiful mother-daughter connection and ever more two adult women kind of connection. But any kind of connection, like the kind that one has with a spouse, you don't need tons of time as long as when you're interacting, it's intentional and really nourishing for both people. And I just think your comment that, essentially you tell me everything, that's not true. It's like there's nothing you would intentionally hold back, but the amount you're actually telling me is a lot less than that.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting at the beginning of what you were talking about. I feel like I take the quality for granted. It just feels like just a standard for how we communicate as a family. But of course, like that's not the case for everyone. And it's interesting as the beginning of the school year here. And as I meet people for the first time, especially underclassmen, I feel like sometimes there's this dance I have in my mind, although it hasn't been conscious till this moment, of like, am I aiming for quality or for quantity in terms of this get to know you conversation, in terms of them feeling comfortable in my space or at Northwestern or in the music school? Because of course I prefer quality and depth. I'm sort of equating those as the same, but it can be so easy to go for quantity at the beginning. But that's like unrelated to you and I and our communications and your communications with Daddy. It just reminds me of what I've been thinking about recently.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to what you said about how you just take it for granted because that's how we do it in our family, that we have a depth of connection, whether there's a lot of communication at one time or another, or there's not. Will you say more about that? Like, is there anything else about that like other adjectives or a story or something to paint that? Because you mentioned it in passing because you do take it for granted, but I think it's an interesting thing to share.
Yeah, well, what comes to mind when you ask that question is the example of my relationship with Christopher, your second child, my closest brother in age, because I think I had always sort of had a fear of when I became an adult growing apart from my siblings. And Christopher and I are like the adult siblings right now. And it's really interesting to me because Christopher and I will not talk for like months and months sometimes. But whenever we do, it's like total quality, totally present. It's not even like no time has passed. It's like that phrase is just a non-issue. And so whether I'm asking for advice or he's asking for advice, he's also done this sweet thing recently where if he is unavailable and I call him, he'll pick up, he'll say, "Hi, I love you. I can't talk right now." And then he'll leave. And somehow that is its own little moment of connection that feels like quality. I mean, that's prime example, not quantity, but quality. And I think it's been a while since I really thought about that, but I think that's an interesting example because on paper, it looks like a disconnected relationship, I think, but in reality, it's not.
Well, to me, I think the way a relationship feels is the reality of the relationship.
Yeah, but this is my own stuff and not necessarily related to this conversation, but I have an interesting history of equating quantity with quality in friendships and relationships when they're not the same. And so I think in this interesting parallel way, as I've gotten older, I've learned to trust quality as being how the relationship feels.
What had you evolve in that way? Is it just something that's naturally occurred, or is there some insight you had?
Well, I think part of it was just time and getting older and in my life realizing I was just like fighting reality to think that I could keep up with all the people I had a lovely moment with at some point in my life. I think I genuinely aspired to that at a certain point, and really wanting to have quality connection with everyone, which is not possible. And I still sometimes feel sad about that. Like, someone has made a really wonderful impact on my life, and I can't then make them a future bridesmaid of mine. That is hard for me.
Right. Well, if you had your druthers, all of your guests at your wedding would be in your wedding party.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So I think part of it is just, I feel like the way the world operates is that you must come to terms with this point. And I think it also leaves space for quality connection in the present moment, instead of holding on to quality connection that happened in the past. Although, of course, the present is built on the past.
Okay, well, as you know, I ask all of my guests based on the fact that relationship is the ultimate vehicle for personal growth, what they've learned from being in their romantic relationship. But with you, really, we're talking about you being my daughter, daddy's daughter, the daughter of our hot, sexy, conscientious, responsible, full spectrum marriage. So I want to kind of adjust the question and ask you, what have you learned about yourself as a result of being our daughter?
I could write an essay. Well, you talk a lot about modeling and the lack of models for quality relationships in our culture. So
I talk about that professionally. It's not something I mention a lot as a mother. I'm just clarifying, but go ahead. Yes.
Professionally, I read your book, all of that. And so I think that the two of you are most certainly, first and foremost, in terms of what I learned, a model for what is possible, a model that I aspire to in so many ways, in terms of the longevity of your relationship, the way you're always growing and changing, and your open-mindedness, while also sort of being clear about what our family culture is at the core, and the way that does or doesn't change. And this is not exactly an answer to your question, but I feel like the older I get, the more I really get to know the two of you as people, not just my parents. Mm-hmm. And that sheds a different light on who I am and where I come from, and the ways that I can communicate with the two of you. It's this weird feeling. It's like the same feeling I get staring into the sky, looking at the stars, thinking about the fact that planet Earth exists. Like, my parents are people who had whole lives before I was born and have their own opinions unrelated to the family dynamic. So I think that's one thing that I've been paying attention to. But also, I feel like what is most on my mind these days is I've learned so many tools in big and small ways about how to feel comfortable in the world and how to navigate so many situations that I think I would just feel totally lost in without the guidance from the two of you, or thinking back to how you handled a situation.
That's beautiful to hear. I'm so glad that I asked this question. Anyone listening gets to hear, but for me in this moment, I get to hear.
Yeah.
And we could end right there, but I'm going to indulge myself and just say that you and I have a podcast. It's called What Should I Do? We haven't done an episode in a while. We'll do one soon. We've done 33 episodes, and if you want to listen to any of them, as I say, the name of the podcast is What Should I Do? And I've had lots of mothers listen to What Should I Do and reach out and ask me how I created such a beautiful relationship with my amazing daughter. And I'm wondering if you, Josephine, have an answer to that question. If someone is listening and wants to be able to have as open-hearted and genuine a relationship with their daughter. Any suggestions from the daughter's perspective?
Well, it's interesting because I've thought about this question a lot as we've gotten feedback on the podcast. And I actually think what you mentioned at the beginning about quality versus quantity is part of that. Because I think, especially as I've gotten older, quality, like, I always just feel so lucky when you are available and when I'm able to communicate with you, because it really feels like we're connected. And it's actually funny because historically, when I was an undergrad, when I would FaceTime you, I would usually be doing other things, and that drove you crazy. And so just seeing all the shifting images. And so for the most part, I think I've been good about not doing that anymore. And if I'm doing anything else, I'm walking, but I'm not multitasking in the same way. And that's actually more about, I think, what I've done through observing what you've done in the past, just in terms of acting similarly in continuing to cultivate our relationship, like giving it full attention, like not taking it for granted in the present moment. But when I think about when I was younger.
Wait, I just want to emphasize that I actually think it's quite wise, sweetheart, because we can often think that a relationship with a child is what it is. And, after a certain age anyway. And I absolutely don't think that. I look at it as a growing living organism that you and I get to adjust, refine, co-create, and transform according to what suits both of us. And I think you've just pointed to that.
Yeah. And I think a current expression of that, which might actually be helpful in terms of people asking this question, is recently, especially as I've gotten older, I love when you share about what's on your mind and your successes and things you're thinking about, sort of that private window into your mind, because I know the private window into my mind, and I share it with you what feels like endlessly, but isn't quite endlessly, as previously discussed. But I always love when recently it feels like a more equal footing when you'll share about an experience that you had, although I'm not so sure that would have felt so meaningful like a few years ago, more than a few years ago. And I also wanted to say, as it relates
Wait, before you say the next thing, that's really important, because as a mother, as a woman, as someone who knows what it is to compromise, I've needed to really have my attention on that, because it's very easy to parent someone in their 20s the same way I'm used to, for example, parenting someone who's 12. In other words, not wanting to burden them or distract them with my own experiences, because their world should be their world. And so I feel like my mother did not do a good job with this. And so I have extra attention on kind of making it work for both of us, but not putting myself in a kind of, in the direction of a martyr as I mother you, but instead to be a full person, knowing that ultimately when I share who I am, and also, of course, make room for you to share who you are, we both benefit, because while that's definitely true in marriage, it's true contextually with every meaningful relationship. Okay, you had one more thing you were going to say?
Well, let me respond to that first. I was just going to say, I think the through line there is authenticity. And I think about how there are some people who, when they interact with kids, they become this like other person instead of just representing themselves. And so certainly, you talk about wanting to model being a woman, and the ways that I've impacted your becoming a relationship coach way back when, before this was truly an idea. And I think the experience of authenticity that I had as a child certainly affected our relationship. I just think, human instinct is we're drawn towards something that feels real.
Maybe we'll end right there. human instinct is that we're drawn towards something that's real. I love hearing you say that. I love that that is true in your soul because of the experiences that you've had in your life and in this conversation, specifically in your family. Any last words, Josephine?
Well, I just want to say that it's a pleasure to be on your podcast. I know more often than not you have two people, and so it's fun to have it just be you and I in terms of one guest. And I think it's just exciting how working on the couple, the relationship there, and thinking about you and Daddy, the ripple effect that it has on so many other relationships. And so I feel really lucky to benefit directly and indirectly from the growth that you and Daddy have done to be the person that I am today, almost 25.
Happy birthday.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Marriage Podcast. Please rate and review the show on iTunes. It really makes a difference. And if you have a question or a comment, reach out to me via my website at alexandrastockwell.com.